Yes, so any questions anyone would like to ask or make observations, comments, anything? Yes, Rashid Sahib?
My question is continuation from yesterday's question.
Yes.
That's why I started straight away.
Yes.
It's not from these sorts of questions which you asked and you explained very nicely. But I have added some more parts to it.
Yes, that's right.
And I want your explanation.
Please go ahead and do it, whatever you want to ask.
Huzur, the verse mentioned yesterday was Lillahi Jama Malam Vadada.
Allahi Jama Malam Vadada.
Sorry, Allahi. Yesterday, Allahi.
You read, N is a joining N from the previous verse's end. So when you read this verse alone, you don't read Nillazi. You read Allahi Jama Malam Vadada. Yes.
Two great powers in the world recently failed to reduce the quantity of their destructive weapons in Iceland. Apparently, this verse is relating to that at the moment. I know it may change its meaning later on. Would you kindly explain about this?
You explain it, because I don't think you're right there. This verse has nothing to do with what's happening in Iceland at the moment, as far as I understand. But because you understand otherwise, so you better explain yourself.
And then the translation of these verses, as we see, woe to every backbiter and slanderer. This is translation given by Mother Teresa, who amass wealth and counts it over and over. He thinks that his wealth will make him immortal.
That's right.
Nay, he shall surely be cast into the crushing torment. This is the translation I read, and I was thinking about
this is a translation which is not literal. Particularly, this crushing torment is a translation by a person who does not understand what the word hutama, but can't understand how a person could be tortured with the help of a hutama. Hutama means the small polarized particle, a very small insignificant particle, the smallest one could think of, not particularly atom, but something very small. So because this was a strange statement that such people would be tortured with the aid of atoms, so Malak Sahib could not conceive of any such thing. So what he did was that he changed the direction by translating it that they would be they would meet with a crushing torment. This is not so. The Holy Quran says, Allazi Yama Kallala Yumbadanna Fil Hutama. This is a completely different statement. So that translation is not correct because it's not literal, and in being metaphorical as well, it does not create the picture which this verse of the Holy Quran creates. It says they would be thrown into the torture of atom. They would be subjected to the torture of atom, not a crushing torment at all. So the literal translation should be they would be subjected to the torment related to the smallest particle. Hotama means a very small insignificant particle. For instance, as I told you earlier, in those days, 1400 years ago, there was no concept of atom at all. But there was a concept of the smallest particle, whatever it was according to their imagination. So the word applicable would be the hutama to such a thing. And if you see in a beam of light small particles which are otherwise unobservable, they can't be seen with naked eye otherwise, but through a beam of light you can see them floating in the air. So, and other dust particles which are hanging in there, they can all be referred to as hutama. So the verse of the Holy Quran simply makes the statement that they would be subjected to the torture of Huttama. But what is not, Jazakallah is not enough. You have yet to explain, even if that translation is considered to be a valid translation, how could you relate that to Iceland, please? You have not yet finished.
I haven't finished. No, it's another 9 parts in the question.
So you have to explain 9 times as much.
Sorry, no.
Why not? The fact is, how could you think of what is happening in Iceland in relation to the translation you have read? That is the question which everybody would be interested to hear your answer. You can come forward. There are a few more audience coming in. You can come forward. Closer, please. Yes? So let's forget about it. Shall we forget about it for the time being?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Please, yes.
So please.
I'm sure you are very blessed with me.
No, please. Yes. I'm very grateful to you. Yes.
Talking about the same question, you were mentioning yesterday.
Yes.
Wama adraka.
Wama adraka. Adraka. Not adraka, but adraka. Yes.
Although this word has been mentioned in the Holy Quran.
Yes.
In 30th para at least 9 times.
Yes.
I've taken that verses, if you allow me.
At least or exactly 9 times.
Well, so 9 times I counted myself.
Yes, so.
I got the references and all that.
So don't say at least. Say it is this expression is used 9 times in the last para.
So what I'm trying to request is, I don't know whether you will allow it or not.
Yes, please.
My request is, would you kindly explain these verses, not here obviously, in some of your special sermons. And there's a lot of highlights which is required from these verses.
No, why don't you read the commentary of Hazrat Muslim Maud on the surahs contained in the last part of the Holy Quran, the 30th part of the Holy Quran. All the chapters therein have been commented upon by Hazrat Muslim Maud, and if you read that commentary, wherever the word Wama Adraka appears, you will find the right answer to that. At least one explanation.
There is a lot of linkage in these verses.
Of course, that link will be also, you will find it described in that commentary by Hazrat Muslim Maud under the title of Tafsir Kabir.
With modern change in the worldly affairs.
Yes, he has taken into account the modern change as well. You just go through it, and then if any questions are left unanswered according to your application of your brain, then you come to me and find out particularly.
Out of these 9 different things, there are 6 warnings and 3 blessings which should be correlated in a special treatment by you, sir. This is my humble request.
So I heard the request and I have answered.
Is also included in these, you see. So that's blessing. The others are warnings. If you allow me, I can go, please.
No, that's right. I know. Please sit down.
Thank you.
That's what I want. Please. Yes. Dr. Mujeeb Sahib. Well, thank you for pointing out. It's a very interesting question, but I am afraid it can't be treated like you want me to treat it. To leave everything else and start doing just this. When the term comes, when the occasion arises, when I feel need of certain verses containing Mahadraka to be explained, I will do that. But not just because you asked me to do this, I should start doing it in the same sequence. It is not possible, it's not proper. Please.
This is in connection with the questions which are compiled by our friend Dr. Clark.
Yes, one of them I briefly handled last night, yes.
They said, sir, that there are some questions in the form of statements, not straightforward questions.
Yes.
The second one here, it says, agnostics claim that moral conscience is simply the product of education and environment. We are taught from childhood that some things are right and others wrong. This early training stays with us all our lives and is confirmed or modified by the pressure of public opinion. No mysterious outside force is required to explain this.
Please. Yes, I agree with the questioner that no mysterious outside force is required. But the statement as has been made is far too simplified and does not relate to the facts of life. The question of morality is a very important and serious question which has been taken up for the last thousands of years by various scholars at various times and philosophers and religious leaders, etc. And so far mankind has not been able to agree on one definition of morality. And the religious people all insist that morality emanates from the concept of God, number one. Number two, it just does not evolve from the concept of God, but it descends from God in clear injunctions, and without that there is no base for morality at all. And the philosophers say that long human experience, very long human experience, has gradually taught them to live in a manner as to be the most beneficial for the social animal aspect of man. Because man can't live alone by himself, there has to be a give and take. So that give and take has been learned by man through a very long historical experience. How long that is, how deep rooted it is yet to be ascertained. Now these are the two philosophical explanations of the concept of morality, but they are not all. If you go to Marx for an explanation of morality, he would reject it on the basis that morality emanates from a fraud consciously committed upon mankind and the poor section of the mankind. He sees morality as an organized crime like mafia, which results from some so-called religious people who were in fact the agents of the capitalist society of the time, bourgeois as they called, and they wanted consciously to deceive people and make them forget their rights. And in the name of morality, their lives were ordered in a manner that they would be told to forgive and to do this and to be humble and never to think of standing up to face the people who had misappropriated the means of livelihood and everything and the sources of power, so that they could not see eye to eye with them and demand their rights. So morality was invented, and all religion is hocus pocus, and it is just a result of this unhealthy union between some fake religious leaders and the wealthy people of the time. So this is another definition of morality and how it came into being. And as far as Lenin goes, he has slightly deviated from Marx by emphasizing that of course morality is very important. Without morality nothing can be done, but it should be defined correctly. The morality according to communism is to be defined as anything which is promotive to the cause of communism and is good for the ultimate end of communism is moral. And that is all what morality is according to Lenin. If hundreds of thousands of people are destroyed and tortured to death looted or their properties burnt out or whatever you do to them, if it is considered by some communist regime that it helps communism ultimately, according to that definition it would be moral. And yet there are others who are anarchists, and they define morality as just nothing. They see, why should we follow any code of life at all? We are individuals, we have no afterlife as it is claimed by the religious people, and so no accountability. When we are not accountable, if we are caught, we will be beaten up by the powerful forces. If we are not caught, then let's enjoy and run away with it, get away with it. So this is the concept of whatever you call it, moral code or immoral code, but still it will be treated under the title of morality. So they say this is morality. So when you reach this stage, the last which I have mentioned, then you immediately realize that morality has definitely something to do with the concept of God. Because without accountability, morality does not mean anything. Morality loses hold on mankind. And this is what was also well understood by Lenin. There was a compatriot of Lenin who wrote a book on morality. He considered that morality is necessary for running any system. No system, however perfect it may be, can be effectively run and implemented without morality. That was his concept, so he wrote a book. Lenin in return wrote a very strong criticism of his pleading the cause of morality, and the name of the book is Imperiocriticism or something. I remember it, I read it about 10-15 years ago, so I think this is Imperio, I remember very clearly, Imperiocriticism or something. But it's a biggish book in small print, and it is entirely devoted to rebut that communist leader who thought it fit to plead the cause of morality in the communist world. And the sentence I have quoted has been taken from that particular book, that this is the definition of morality, and beyond that we don't know any morality. Now his argument is particularly directed towards God or against God. What he says is that don't take this innocently. Whenever you talk of morality, there cannot be a morality true in the sense of as it is understood by the world without the concept of God. So whether you start with God, you will end up with immorality. And if you start with God, you will end up in morality. If you start with morality, you are bound to end up in God. So he understood it much better than the questioner has. And the questioner does not know the history of morality. When we come across the concepts of morality, morality always starts from some religion. And basically the fundamental concepts of morality are the same despite the fact that these religious sources never came into contact with each other. I mean, these by these I mean many religious sources of the olden time who never came into contact with each other had the same concept of morality. Fundamental morality of man remains the same, and it has been taught by religion. So to say that morality was taught, it evolved automatically and some people gave us the ideas, of course, if we are taught something in the childhood, we grow up with that. But whatever moral concept we find in the world, without fail it has a religious history and a religious origin. So Lenin's prediction came to be fulfilled later on, although he dispelled morality from his country on the plea that it is bound to lead you to God, which we can't tolerate, because then our system will lose its justification. Marx and Lenin were very highly intelligent people, and they were true to themselves, there is no doubt about it. So they understood if you are true and intelligent, your corollary has to be the right within a limited sphere. Though it may not be wise overall, but in the limited sphere of application of their minds, they draw the right conclusions. So his conclusion here, subject to this limited application, was right, that if you consider morality to be a valid instrument for the implementation of communism in the communist countries, you will not stop there, because morality has a very deep relationship with God and you will be led to God. So he poo-pooed the idea and put his foot down that no morality should be applied. With the result that plurial of morality was also right, because no system can run effectively and honestly and truly without a moral code. So communism in Russia started taking different directions, and it went awry. It completely lost its orientation, and this is why the Chinese started dubbing them as revisionists. What happened in China is also a relevant question, relevant chapter to this question. Mao Zedong, on the other hand, although he was not less intelligent than Lenin was, but perhaps more intelligent in some ways, he has a wider vision. He insisted on morality. And he said, without morality, no system can run, so I must introduce morality. Now, when he talked of morality, he couldn't invent morality. Morality can't be invented. He had to delve deep into the sources of Confucianism. And whatever he says of morality, he has borrowed from Confucianism and from nowhere else. So he was right too, but not entirely. Also Lenin was right partly. The result was that more he stressed on morality, more minds were turned towards God. And ultimately he found to his disappointment, and he was in fact panic driven to note this fact, that the communists, being communist, although they were more honest with their system and implemented communism more honestly and diligently in their country during his time, they started turning to religion and started talking of Confucianism. And they said, why not wed our communism with religion and believe in both things, because they knew all this moral talk was not coming from Mao Zedong, but a much wiser, older religious leader had said the same things. So he solved this question, this dilemma, by making alternate currents. Every few years you find in Mao Zedong's time stresses on morality and war against Confucianism. You see, this was his answer to the dilemma he faced. So it's so surprising to find why suddenly he thinks of going into war with Confucianism and does it at a very large scale. Because there he knew that morality can't live by itself without generating the concept of God. Because originally it comes from him. And that did not suit him. So he wanted to eat his cake and also have it and run away with it. So to a degree he got succeeded as well, but not entirely. That morality has left Chinese communism with a deep impact, so that they are no longer entirely scientific socialists anymore. Religious ideas and human concepts are taking birth, being generated here and there. And this is why the latest policy of the Chinese regime here is basically different from the concept of communism as translated in Russia. And again, this is why Russians call them revisionists. So both allege each other to be revisionists, and both are partly right and both are partly wrong there. So morality is a subject which can't be discussed in a simple statement like the one made by the questioner. It's an issue of much wider application and much deeper application in subjectivity as well as objectivity. In subjectivity, one has to sink deeper into human psychology and find out the sources and why morality is there and how much is there, it is there to be found. And in objectivity, one has to widen one's field of studying this question, studying morality in China, in Europe, in other places of the world, in Africa, and finding out whether it is built on one single pattern, or coherent pattern, parallel pattern, or it is divergent with each other. The concept is, completely disunited and irrelevant to each other. And also, we have to go deeper into history of mankind and history of the concepts of morality. One thing which can be demonstrated easily here, which I have been demonstrating to my Christian friends when I was a student here at the University of London, was that although the concept of cleanliness in the West is much more strictly implemented, but the cleanliness and hygiene are about, confused with each other here. And there is another concept of cleanliness which is born out of religious morality, which is not found here at all. So I used to demonstrate to my friends that you owe so much to religion that whatever your religion has not taught you, even 1,000 years of civilization have not taught you either. You can't invent it yourself. But the Muslims, though hygienically, are much, much below you in status, in application of hygienic values and cleanliness. But whatever they were taught 1400 years ago, they follow it still in part, and wherever they follow it, they are far advanced than you are today. For instance, washing yourself after going to urination. When you go for the call of nature, Islam told the followers, religiously speaking, that your moral code is that you should wash yourself. And this was not told to the Christian civilization by Christianity in so many words. So whatever civilization this civilization achieved, they could not yet discover the supremacy of this conduct, excellence of this conduct, with the result that they didn't do it. Even up to now, they would clean themselves with a dry piece of paper or things, and they would think it is enough. It is not enough. It is filthy according to religious concept of morality, I mean. And also hygienically it can be proved that this is a bad habit. It can cause into gradual filthiness of your clothes and bad smelling and collection of bacteria and all that. And also one doesn't feel clean once one has known the habit of washing oneself. One can't fall back to this simple, rudimentary habit of cleaning oneself with a cloth or with something else. So there are other things which I used to demonstrate to them, which came to us as a religious code of morality. And they are practiced in the most, elementary societies of the Muslim world, where the economic standards are also just rock bottom, and they can't fall beyond that. Still the people are cleaner because they wash their mouth 5 times a day, and this morality of washing oneself and appearing in public, in so many ways, as Islam tells, not when you are filthy according to Islamic standards, is also practiced in the poorest society as well. And this I could, the difference it has created is so obvious and so strong that one simply cannot ignore it. I was comparing in some ways the poorest Muslim, the most backward Muslim society with the most advanced Western society, and I try to demonstrate that things which were not told to them by religion, they did not learn by themselves. And if you compare the poor societies of one religion with the poor societies of Islam in other places, then you find the great difference. Here at least the society appears much cleaner than the Muslims in the backward countries, because I have said hygienically they have adopted this way of life which appears to be very clean, but they don't have the concept of paki and napaki. This I leave out for a while because it will lead me to another discussion. That also, based on religious morality, paki and napaki, and Islam teaches you a lot of values from that angle too, which no civilization could conceive, because it is purely a religious angle. For instance, when I once visited India in 1964, I think, yes, and I took a tanga in the morning at the prayer time. The tanga driver was not a Muslim, and he was never told to wash himself in the morning. First thing he gets up, and he should clean his mouth 5 times a day with kuli and rinse his mouth and so on, or use miswak and things. And because he was poor, he could not afford to have a toothpaste and a clean habit of using toothpaste and brush, etc. So his breath was far more stinking than the breath of the horse he was driving. It was impossible for me to sit facing him, So all the time I had to face the other way, hoping for the fresh breath of air, to take away the sting. And I knew then that a Muslim tanga driver, however poor he may be, if he was praying 5 times a day, whatever his state of affairs, he would be found in, almost in rags, but his breath would not be that ugly or that bad. Because this is a religious morality which has been given to us by religion. So now if you start working backwards, right from the Western civilization too, you will find that their civil habits, their courtesy is directly rooted into Christian teaching. There is absolutely no doubt about it. The people who lived in Europe prior to Christianity, their moral code and their habits and the way of life was so totally different that if Christianity had not played her part in modeling them, in shaping their character, in cultivating concept of morality into them, it would not have been possible to create the Western civilization with stresses on courtesy and kindness and everything. So all that is good in this civilization, they owe from Christianity. All that is bad in this civilization, they owe to their own way of thinking, So how can one say that anyone, Tom, Dick and Harry, can create morality for himself or for these people, and it is something to be built like that? It is wrong. I mean, it has in no relationship to realities of life, and too simple a statement to be accepted as such. And even if you do ultimately succeed in making a perfect code of morality artificially by your own, first of all, it is not possible because the questioner already admits that he is under the influence of the background teaching he received in the childhood, and all the time he will be thinking of something new. There will be some religious teaching in the background of his mind telling him, yes, this is the right way and that is the right way. So he can't say that it is a totally independent effort. He will be always working under the moral influence of some religion. but let us forget it. Suppose somebody has never heard of any religious teaching and is so gifted by nature, because they don't believe in God, let's say nature, that he conceives of a perfect code of morality. How is he going to implement it? Just tell me how. The governments cannot enforce morality through coercion. Laws can be forced to a measure, but morality goes much deeper. It works when you are alone by yourself. Otherwise you are not a moral animal, you are an animal working under compulsions. So morality has a quality of independence about it which does not need to be enforced. Whenever it is enforced, it is not called morality at all. So how is he going to implement that morality? The fact is that morality is related to a background consciousness of accountability. It gets rooted with the help of that consciousness of accountability. If you are accountable to some being after your death, then there is an inner compulsion in you which is nothing to do with outer coercion of states. And that helps give permanence to the concept of morality. Without that, it will break down very soon. Even if you teach such people that you should be moral and this and that, it will totally break down and crumble into pieces because there is no inner coercion without the concept of God. So you can't live without him. If you do, you can choose a way of life, but then don't try to gain the values which can only be gained through the help of religion and with the concept of God, not otherwise. Yes, any other question, please? Bashir Yasser, yes, I understand. One of your legs is hurting again, huh? Because he is changing postures. Whenever now instead of raising his hand for a question, he starts moving restlessly, to draw my attention. Yes, please. Yes. Wa alaikum assalam.
Would Hazur most kindly advise us the difference between bid'ah, innovation in religion, and ittihad, interpretation of Islamic law? Secondly, explain the difference between mujtahid, religious director, and mujaddid, renewer or revivalist.
Now please, let's start with the first question. What is it that you find confusing in the two? I mean, they have no relationship at all. Innovation and ijtihad, they don't belong to the same category, same field. So what is it that you find confusing and which you want to be explained? I can't follow your question. Can't truly comprehend what you want to know.
And ittihad, these are the things later.
What do you understand by the word bidat, please?
Bidat, there are so many things like bidat. For example, tabiz.
Yes.
That's a bidat.
Yes.
Or go to the graves and pray there, or put some sheets on the graves and all this, and ask something from the dead bodies.
Yes.
And like rosemary. Leaves.
Now, why do they do it? Why these people do it?
Some of the scholars, they think they introduce them, might have introduced them with good faith, but ultimately the practice is...
No, what is their explanation for this? Do they find it based on the teaching of the Holy Quran and the traditions of the Holy Prophet, or do they claim that it is something new which we have invented?
I think this is a later thing which they invited. But
so what is ijtihad?
Ijtihad is interpretation of Islamic law. They get something.
So you already have made the difference. What are you asking then? You know the answer of your question yourself. You have made it very clear to me. That innovation is something which you create anew, which has no foundation in the basic religious teaching of Sharia or law of the book. And ijtihad is something based on the basic teachings of that book or the conduct of the Prophet of that religion. So you have made it very clear and you know it correctly. What?
No, what comes in my mind, for example,
Yes.
Some of the scholars in Islam,
Yes.
although they say that like ijtihad, they say
Hello, yeah.
regarding the rights of the women, for example, they should be given more education or more opportunities to work and all this. Some of the things may be contrary to what are the other ulama's things.
So what has it got to do with your question?
That's why I say
That is why I say it has no relationship with your question.
no, they may say that this are doing some bid'ah or something, inventing new, which is not found in the Sunnah and the Quran.
So what
They
will,
may think, they look that
let them think so, but what would be your answer then? If they think so, how would you treat them? What would be your answer to them? Will you accept their plea?
I don't know, because this is such a,
I think no. You won't accept their plea.
such a little, difference. So some of the things may not be agreeable in the...
You know, we can't discuss such matters in detailed application of the things here in a session like this. As far as the principal difference is concerned, fundamental difference between bid'ah, that is innovation, and ijtihad, which is deduction, it is clear to everyone. There is no difference whatsoever. The difference only would arise in the application of these two things. From one vantage point, some people would consider an act or a custom to be bid'ah because they don't see any relationship with that practice with the Sunnah or with the Holy Quran. So they have a right to call it bid'ah because they don't understand any connection. Others who do it may claim that there is a connection and they may continue to plead for that to be not a bid'ah but an authenticated religious practice. Different. Everybody understands that. The application can be confusing for some, but then it will have to be treated on merit. If you want to find out a particular thing, whether it is bid'ah according to me or it is based on the Holy Quran and the teachings of the Rasulullah, then of course I can answer that question. But as far as the difference is concerned, you know it. Everybody knows it. They are two different things altogether. Yes, please.
The second part.
How many parts there are to it?
Trying to explain the difference between a muntarid and a mujaddid.
They have nothing to do, they are different terms altogether. Ijtihad is a constant process which is never broken, and it is not an office created by God. Ijtihad, anybody who deduces things from the basic teachings of anything is a mujtahid. So the moment a truth is revealed, ijtihad begins, and it's an unbroken, continuous process. Mujaddid is a reformer. So can't you see difference between the two things? Mujaddid is a reformer and mujtahid is the one who always gives a point of view. And the whole society is full of mujtahideen. Even you are a mujtahid in your own limited sphere. Every man has to be a mujtahid. Whenever you choose a way of life, you do it by the application of your own deductions. So when the deductions of one single person are ultimately held in high esteem, and more people begin to follow him and have faith in his deductions, then he gradually rises to the status of a mujtahid, the so-called mujtahid. Otherwise, everybody is a mujtahid. Please. Yes.
Yesterday there was a question about Hazrat Usman Farooqi of Nigeria.
Yes.
Whether he was Mujaddid.
Whether he was a mujaddid or not.
And in answer to that question, Guru said that it is not necessary to believe in Mujaddid.
Yes.
Now the question...
It is necessary to believe in the office of Mujaddidiyat, but it is not necessary to believe in a Mujaddid because he is not Mamur in the sense. If I explain it further, then perhaps your question will drop out automatically. All right, you first point out. Yes, exactly, please.
Number one is that the hadith which speaks about Mujaddid, revivals of faith. It says that in Allah ya Rasul Hazim.
Right.
That Allah will appoint those.
Yes.
Mujaddid.
Yes.
So they are people who are appointed by Allah.
Correct.
So now in that connection, the first question.
I agree. But the fact is, I understand, this is what I wanted to explain myself. The fact is that Allah has appointed the Mujaddideen and has not told them to claim that they are Mujaddideen. So how can it become compulsory for the people to believe in them as Mujaddideen? You know, most of the Mujaddideen of their time never discovered themselves that they were Mujaddideen. And they were found out later on by the centuries by judging their work, the quality and the excellence of the services to Islam they rendered. They were considered later on by the future generations related to their time to be Mujaddideen. And yet you agree that Allah had deputed them, Allah had raised them. Now here Yabaso does not mean that Allah raised them and made it binding upon all the people to believe in them. If Allah had so done, there would certainly have been a movement of a great strife against them. And that only happens in Nabuwa. You know, the whole society is severed from such people who are consciously raised by Allah and told to declare it to the world without ambiguity that they have been appointed as the leaders of that religion by God Himself. This phenomenon is Nabuwa and not Mujaddidiyat. In Mujaddidiyat, the raising simply means that Allah brings them up. Allah educates them and teaches them and has a special relationship of blessing with them, over them, or special relationship with them and covers them with His special blessing, so that they are brought up under the sight of Allah, and this is how they are raised by Allah. And they are created for doing great deeds of service for Islam, so that all that needs repair is repaired with their help. This is the concept of Mujaddidiyat. So you don't find any struggle starting from Mujaddideen. You know, when Mujaddid and the rest of the society are totally broken off and a great movement of opposition begins, and they start again from one individual, and gradually grow into the people of believers and people who believe in Allah and so on. That phenomenon is Nabuwa and not Mujaddidiyat.
Now, in that connection, there is another hadith which says that no mata bighair imam, faqat mata mahasmita al-jahil. Now, what is that imam? Does the Mujaddid also included in that?
Now, what are the words of this tradition, this hadith?
No mata.
This is not man mata bighair al-imam.
There are two, I think, questions.
If you think, then don't quote it because you're not sure. But this version is right, I know, remember. Man lam yarif imama zamanihi faqad mata matat al-jahiliya. Yes. And this is the reliable one, and this, because this has an internal logic. It means that if somebody is born in the time of an imam, a leader which has been appointed by God, and he refused to recognize him, fails to recognize him, then he has died the death of an ignorant person. So after that, the question you were about to raise would not arise. That doesn't guarantee that every age must have an imam. This tradition does not guarantee. What it says is simply this, that if somebody is present when there is also an imam and he does not recognize him, then he has died the death of an ignorant person. It holds water, it's so logical. Yes, Dr. Nazeer Sahib?
It just occurred to me, the difference I want to be clarified to Imam Laha and Imam Meruwa. First, this ayat in Quran, Allah Ta'ala has been to Amin Salihati, yes, from now to that, the Master Dina in Tabahim, so I will not know Dina to Zalahum, but the Betelum, that of Amna, so young women in the right in Shaya, from Kafar Badarata, Falaita,
Mufasikun, not Kafirun.
No, yes.
Yes, yes. So that is the answer to your question. Yes, yes. Yes. Any other question, please? You know, the question he wanted to ask was, whoever refuses to believe in a Khalifa, not in a prophet, will he be also bracketed with kafir, kuffar, that is non-believers, or infidels, whatever name you give them? And then he completed the verse, he knew the answer. It was already mentioned in that verse at the end, that if you reject a Khalifa, don't believe in him, you become a fasik and not a kafir. If you follow the Prophet of that ummah and don't reject him, and you don't believe Khalifa, then you are a man with rejectable conduct. Your conduct is bad. But your doctrine will not be rejected as such because you believe in the Prophet of that ummah. So, yes, please. You have thought of another question, another couple of questions? Yes. Rashid Sahib, huh? Yes, please.
Would I just make a statement before I ask the question?
Of course, yes, go ahead.
At Hadith al-Jamaat, we asked a question to the vicar belonging to the Church of England.
Yes.
About the text of Genesis.
Yes.
And I've also read in the Catholic magazine, the same thing referring to Genesis. The Church of England vicar said that what is written in Genesis is mythical. This is his word. And it shouldn't be taken literally. It's, the truth is deeper than that so. And the Catholic magazine said the same thing, that it's a fictional account. So that surprised me hearing from these sources. The question is, how do you know which part is literal and or metaphorical in all these holy books? What criteria do you use?
Well, after all that has been said and done about it, one is left with no definite criterion, unfortunately. You know, the fact is that Church has gone through a very, very long history, spreading over about 2000 years. And for the things which were gradually learned by man and were found in contradiction with Bible to a degree, they had an answer applicable to that time. So their position kept on shifting along with the discovery of man or the increasing knowledge of man. So this is the present day stance, which is not the stance of the yesterday. Yesterday this stance was completely different. There was a time, at the time of Galileo, when Galileo said this, that I don't deny the authenticity of Bible or for it to be a word of God. What I say is something may be metaphorical, may be mythical, and we should not take it too seriously and literally. And what is literally true is this, what we discover. And he was, as you know, he was almost condemned to death, and he had to, retrieve his step, and that is the one dishonorable blemish on his character which the scientists have never been able to forgive him. That to save his life, he took an equivocal position and started retracing his meaning by saying his words, by saying, no, I meant this and I meant that, and he was guided there by such people who had friendship with both the parties, the church as well as Galileo. And they taught him, if you use these words, you will wriggle out of this and no punishment will be meted out to you. But a punishment was meted out to him by God, not by the church this time. He ended up blind. The person who invented the telescope ended up blind. And when you read his comments on this, they're so pathetic. I'm quite certain that it was a punishment. He wanted to escape from the punishment of the church, which wanted to mete out a punishment to him in the name of God, but not actually from God. So he escaped that temporary punishment, but met a punishment at the hands of God, which was so ironical for him too, which just fitted with his situation. He wrote in the end that I was the man who gave, I don't remember exactly the words, but who enlarged the mind of man. It was so limited. It was limited to a very small universe. I expanded the universe for mankind. And now I find myself squeezed into just the body where I belong. And all that expansion has been taken away from me. The sight plays such a role, and as if he gave expansion to the universe and then got squeezed into that small place and was made a prisoner of his body. His expression is very beautiful. I don't remember the exact words, but this is the essence of that. So this is in fact what church used to do previously regarding the understanding of the Bible. So they go on changing their stance according to the relationship of knowledge of that time with them, and they want to keep people's faith alive, whatever they may discover. So the times are over when they used to say that, well, that this is little whether you believe it or not. Now they say, no, it's not little. So believe whatever you may, but don't reject the Bible. So there is a sort of passive compromise, not a real power, I must warn you. This is why the present day generations are turning more towards atheism. They don't show a violent reaction against this. They say, all right, you can live in a sort of compromise. We won't challenge it. If it is mythical, let it be mythical. But we are no longer the same believers as we used to be in the earlier centuries, when we considered this book to be literal. Now it could be anybody's imagination. It may not be the word of God at all. And also the concept of its being mythical does not solve all the questions raised by internal contradictions in many places. So this is why the subject you raised is very important. This is why Islam takes the stance that wherever you find something against the creation of God, you must reject it not because God had said it, but because this must have been interpolated later on by man, by ignorant people. So there is no, this approach is not necessary that you prove that at that stage this line was introduced later on, and in the previous versions of the Bible this line is not present, or this style of expression was not present in the earlier versions and it was introduced later on. The present approach of the Western scholars is exactly this. The approach of the Holy Quran is not this. It says that it is impossible for God to contradict His creation, because He is the one creator who is also the master of the world. So there has to be a perfect unison between in His universe, whether it is the religious universe, spiritual universe, or the material universe. This is what is said in Surah Mulk, for instance. Tabarakalladhi biyadihi al-mulku wa huwa ala kulli shay'in qadirun alladhi khalaqa al-mawta wal hayata liyabluwakum ayyukum ahsanu amala wa huwa al-azizul ghafur alladhi khalaqa sab'a samawatin tibaqa ma tara fi khalqi ar-rahman min tafawut farji al-basara hal tara min futur thumma arji al-basara karratayn yanqalib ilayka al-basaru khasi'an wa huwa hasir. I leave the translation of the first part, but the directly relevant part is the second bit. It says that God has created heavens in 7 spheres, and you won't find any contradiction in the creation of God. Search for it, look for it, anywhere you please, and you won't find any contradiction. Repeat this, try again. Your sight will return to you tired and haggard and defeated. Yet it would not find any contradiction in the creation of God. So the Holy Quran or the other books of the holy books, according to this statement, because they are word of God and there can't be any contradiction between anything which comes from God. So whenever there is a contradiction between the word of God and the other word of God, or the word of God on the one hand and the creation of God on the other hand, then that contradiction is a handiwork of man and could not be the word of God. So this is our attitude to the not only to the biblical statements, but also to the other statements of other religious books as well. And our criterion would be, as a questioner asked me, how would you know that this is from God and that is not from God? If there is no contradiction in statements, that would be from God. There is no doubt about it, because it means people have not taken interest enough in that to change it to suit their requirements or their imaginations. And if there are contradictions, either both of them should be rejected, or at least one would be held to be true and the other be rejected. And for that, the criterion for a Muslim adopts is that if one of the two statements of the Bible which appear to be contradictory to each other agrees with the statement of the Holy Quran and the other does not, then we know that this must be true, because the Holy Quran, we believe, is the same book intact. So if statements are made like, that for instance it was a real snake which walked into heaven and talked to Adam and so on and so forth, because it is against the facts of nature, either we will reject or we will agree with the Christian scholars that it must have carried a message and the language must have been a figurative language. And if we find the meaning behind it, and that meaning is consistent with the concept of religion, then we won't reject it as interpolation or literal either. Then you know that here a figure of speech is used. But where there is no possibility of any reconciliation between a statement in the manner that we can call it a figure of speech and done away with it, then we'll have to admit naturally that this part is an interpolation, and unfortunately we can't agree with it. So just generalization won't do. You'll have to examine a particular piece which is in question and see it from all these angles which I have just mentioned. Please.
Referring to the Bible, recently I was looking through 2 Chronicles of Muslim Marvel, referred to a contradiction, referring to a king whose name I've forgotten at the moment, but he had a son who couldn't have that age at the time.
Yes.
Was apparently born before his father.
Quite.
Absolutely impossible.
Quite.
And yet, he was a younger son as well.
Yes.
And that was virtually impossible.
Quite.
What happened was that recently I've been reading the New Standard American Bible.
I see.
And instead of the age that is given in all the, and that was the date of that, I think, published date, that was the 1960s, around the 1960s. And before that, the age of the king, the son, when he was born, when he became king, was roughly about 42. It was 42. It was 42. And in the Standard American Bible, that's been replaced blatantly by 22. Just blatantly. No other alteration at all.
Yes.
So I'm just bringing that point up.
That you better write a short note on that for review of religion, for the review of religions. So it can be pointed out to the Christian world that you shouldn't do this now, I mean, before public eye at least. You have no right to do this. Unless they prove their point by saying that the later day version which we inherited from some previous generations was wrong because it was not a true translation of the previous version in some other language and so on and so forth. Sometimes they succeed in doing it, then of course we will rectify our position. And we say that we based this claim of contradiction in that particular book on some translations made by Christian scholars. Now when you have proved that that translation was wrong, we withdraw our objection. But in this case, this is a wrong way. If there is an objection raised against it, nobody has a right to amend the word of God to suit the requirements of a particular time. This is a wrong attitude. So you better write to them as well as write to the review of religion about it. And now what was it you wanted to ask this young boy? Yes, please. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. By the way, who are you? Would you introduce yourself, please?
My name is Asif Siddiq.
You are the son of Mr. Muhammad Siddiq of, from where? Hounslow, yes.
Grandson of Maulid Taibin.
That's right, now I understand, yes. He's staying here temporarily, he is coming from Saudi Arabia. You are coming from Saudi Arabia, aren't you?
Yeah.
No, I thought you are the maternal, you are the son of his daughter, not of his son. Understand? He is your Maulid Taibin Sahib, is your maternal uncle, not paternal uncle, not maternal grandfather, not paternal grandfather. Is that right? Right, yes. Yes, of course, your name is Mubashir, not Siddiq. Yes, I should have understood it, yes. Please.
When I'm about to preach, I try and change people's religion to a Muslim. What should I do this when I've never changed my religion?
I couldn't follow this, this garble. Please.
When I'm about to preach, I try and change people's religion to a Muslim. What should I do if I've never changed my religion?
Could anybody assist me, please?
Says when I go to preaching, I intend to change other religions.
When he goes to preaching to them, he says, I'm Muslim, I don't change my religion, why should I change?
Well, the fact is that we understand the concept of preaching. If it is based on arbitrary desires, that you should change other people's religions, then it is wrong. It has no justification, and you are quite right. If somebody comes to you and wants you to change your religion, you go to your, take your road and do what you may, but this is my religion, that is your religion. But there is nothing arbitrary about it in Islamic attitude, in every sane attitude. People try to change the political ideas of others, the social ideas of others, and if they do it through persuasion and not through coercion, it is accepted in the society. The labor preaches for the labor philosophy of life, and the conservatives preach for the conservative philosophy of life, and they go on changing sides from time to time. This is why sometimes you find a labor government in power, and sometimes a conservative government in power. So what is this going on? Why people change side or want other people to change side? Because they think their doctrine, their concept of things is better for mankind than the doctrine or concept held by the opposition or by the other people. So if you think you are in the right and you are serious about it, it is a natural desire in you to see that other people also follow the same path, which will lead them to a better way of life. And if preaching is born out of this desire, then it is good and it is beneficial for the mankind. If it is born out of just a desire for gaining strength and grandeur and more power, to sway power over others, then you have no right to preach at all. Then your attitude is correct, that I don't change my religion and you don't change your religion. So in religions, this is the motive force of preaching. As long as you understand Islam and you think it is better for the ultimate good of mankind and for every individual in his future life to come, then it will be very selfish on your part if you don't preach, won't it? So then you invite others and tell them that if you think that your way of life is better, both in application here in this world and in the afterworld, then you preach to me. You should encourage preaching, both ways. So if you are ultimately convinced, for instance, that Christianity is a better way of life, you shouldn't stick to Islam because you are born here. And the vice versa is also true. Expect your friends to come into agreement with you on this principle issue, that we should only follow truth as we understand it. So it's just an attempt to make other people see your point of view in religion and to make them agree to the fact that what you believe is not only right, but it is a better way of life for him than what he believes in. What is wrong there? Why shouldn't he change sides then? Now you understand this point? Yes, please. Is it time for prayer, or would someone like to ask a question or two? Yes, please. Well, please go to the microphone and you make your observation there.
Observation. Where there are a lot of Christians, Jews, and some other.
Yes.
And during the lunchtime, we go to a restaurant and eat. All being Muslim, they don't eat pork and the rest.
And the Jews don't eat pork either.
Yes.
The Jews don't eat pork either, so you have company. Yes.
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 But see, when I told the waiter that I don't eat pork, and I told the officer that there is a lot of interest. That's why we don't
Created, yes, that's right.
So I keep telling them that I'm Muslim, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But, you know, they wouldn't agree with me. So I got really fed up. One day, one Christian asked me, why don't you eat this pork? And I just asked him, are you a Christian as well? So he said, how? So well, in Christianity you must not be eating pork. So I don't eat pork. I'm a good Christian as well. So after that, they don't object to it.
That's good. Thank you. You know, once I had an experience like this, not like this, but your statement has reminded me of that. Way back in 1956, I think, I was a student at the University of London, and I went to eat at the refectory. The lunch I always had there, and the dinner I cooked myself. So I went there and I stood in the line, the queue. That day, the lady which used to serve us was not there, and she knew very well that I wouldn't eat this and wouldn't eat that, and so there was no problem for me. There was another young girl standing in her place. So sometimes I found that when you said I don't eat pork, they would give you bacon, if not pork or bacon, that sort of thing. So to emphasize the point, jokingly I said, look here lady, I don't eat the flesh of what you call swine, The flesh of swine is forbidden, and so I don't eat that. So everybody laughed and she, recorded the fact. And when I took the plate of whatever it was and sat on the table, another young man followed me who was a Pakistani. And after a while he shifted his position and came closer to me, closer and closer. And then ultimately I felt he wanted to be free with me, to say something to me. So I said, yes, what is it please? He said, who are you? He said, there are so many other Muslims, Pakistanis and Arabs, and they are eating pork freely. So what sort of Muslim are you? He said, I am not a Muslim, I am also Muslim and I am eating pork. So why don't you? I said, because I belong to Ahmadiyya community and we mean what we do, what we say. That is the only difference. So then he, kept quiet for a while, I could see him crestfallen and a bit depressed after this answer. And then he said, do you know what? I said, what? He said, I am the son of an Ahmadi leader who is the greatest opponent of Ahmadiyya in the region where I live in Pakistan. And so much so that Ataullah Shah Bukhari, whenever he visits our place, he comes to stay with us. And then he started disclosing certain habits of these religious leaders, and they do this and that and that. And I'm thinking that they used to tell me that you are the worst people on earth and you have nothing to do with Islam and all this, and you're the only person who is, behaving like this, and I'm really surprised. So I want to know more, and he became very friendly. And then we didn't exchange addresses. We sat there and chatted, and I could see a special affinity in his eyes for me and my way of life and all that. So we got separated. In 1983, I received a message from someone, some political Muslim leader here, that he wanted to see me. And he came and saw me and we discussed things of this and that. And suddenly I looked at his face, I said, are you the boy who met me in 1956 at the University of London refectory and said this to me? And he jumped and embraced me and said, yes, I'm the boy. I was also saying, I was wondering, I have seen you somewhere and, I couldn't recollect. So you have rightly located me. So immediately, as if we knew each other for ages, and that all was triggered off with the same subject as you have mentioned, the fact of not eating the pork. So who will say Azan tonight? Khaja Sahib's Azan is very loud and very, filling. The whole atmosphere is filled with Azan. I like it, but I also like to give chance to others as well. Everybody has his own qualities of charm in his Azan. So I think you should go on changing, from one to the other. So whom are you appointed tonight? Well, it's up to you. I'm just telling you. It's not necessary that every time it should be Khaja Sahib, although voice has a very great, quality, grandeur and awe. But go on to change the taste, go on changing one to the other. Right?
Also, something sir about pork, I want to ask tonight, very important.
Very important?
Yes, sir.
Oh, please go ahead.
That is confirmed from you, sir, about this pork eating.
Yes.
When I was staying, and I used to go and buy some meat in shop or anywhere else, and they are selling pork on the side, and I wanted a carne of the milk, that means they goat and sheep. And then I asked them, who is greater? One who eats swine, who is greater, Christ or Paul? Who brought to Christianity this strong eating?
Yes.
Is Paul greater or is Christ greater? He said Christ. I said, I am was Christ, we can't follow Christ. He is unity of God and we follow the word of God, never faith God. And they were stunned and no reply.
Jazakumullah, thank you. Thank you for this very important revelation. Yes, please, Azan now.